is Steve Zelser with the United Front Committee for a Labor Party, and we are having this panel tonight to discuss the issue of the COVID pandemic, capitalism, and what working people need to do in this country and internationally to end the virus, to shut down the virus, and to defend working people, and particularly what working people need to do in their unions and organizations to make them do what they should do, or to build organizations that will do that. So thanks for joining us on this important panel about the COVID pandemic and where we're at. So the first, I want to welcome you all, and also say that this is a number of panels we've already had, and also we had the first demonstration, public demonstration in the United States at the California Board of Governors of the community colleges to demand a zero COVID policy. And we are want to continue that in California and nationally to build a zero COVID movement. Most working people haven't heard what zero COVID is. And of course, China has come under attack, New Zealand, and also Taiwan, because they have a COVID zero policy. So we're going to get into that tonight and talk about also the role of the union in not really fighting for a COVID zero policy, which is critical. So our first speaker is going to be Nayvin Gordon, who's a physician, family physician, who's been involved in public health and been writing about the need to have a zero COVID policy. So welcome, Nayvin.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think we've gone over a lot of this material, so I don't want to take too much time, because you have spoken to the reason for this meeting being what can working people do about the situation. I think that's important. I mean, in a nutshell, we know there is extremely widespread virus throughout the entire country, and the data is being suppressed. It's insufficient, incomplete, inaccurate, and being suppressed. Since everything's been opened up for the last 3 or 4 months, we can assume it is almost everywhere. The numbers of people that have died, not only been infected, but died, is vastly underestimated. The Scientific American and The Economist both said the numbers in the US probably are well over 1 million deaths. So that, you know, the picture is much worse than what they're painting it as. And the other point is that it's clearly related to the profit motive and how that's panned out since 1980. I think the key to this is 1980, the World Bank basically issued a new policy, and that is that they would privatize health and privatize public health systems throughout the world. And as a result, in the last 40 years, they basically decimated public health systems throughout the world and in favor of treatment. So this pandemic shows clearly what that means for them. What it means is that any epidemic coming will kill as many as it needs to kill. If the death rate is, 1%, then we're going to lose 1%. It won't change anything in my mind if the next virus comes through and it's 10 times worse. There's no infrastructure to do anything other than what they're doing now. So we'll lose, instead of 1 million in a year or so, we're going to lose 10 million while they're busy trying to figure out what new vaccine they can create and what kind of drugs they can use to treat it. So from my point of view, we're in a period now where mass epidemics created basically by the profit systems, industrial agriculture and food raising, has moved into the natural world in such a way that these viruses are now ripping through our society. So it's very clear from what Steve said that there's a major attack on zero COVID, because initially they went, the powers that be went along with the scientific community, said, we've got to do something. Let's do the old public health 101. And so they went with that, but it became very clear that that's too expensive. They can't make any money doing that. So now there's a massive campaign throughout the world to try and attempt to get every country that has successfully carried out zero COVID policies to turn it around and let them live with the virus. That's their new thing. We're going to just live with it. It's going to be here forever. So therefore, the pressure on New Zealand, has intensified. Singapore also, and assume that they're going to try and push zero COVID out everywhere. It's clear that the science behind zero COVID is absolutely true. There's no question about the fact that it is a scientific reality that if there was will, we could eliminate this virus. But what I see is that the only force possible that would eliminate, institute zero COVID is the working people. So for me, I think the key thing is how workers need to protect themselves with rank and file health committees of some type, which demand on the job protection, which could incorporate a lot of the issues of zero COVID policy. In other words, we will have an organization that has to obviously fight the corporate unions because they're not doing anything about it. So it has to be a rank and file health committee that organizes their co-workers to say, look, we cannot come to work if you refuse to daily test for COVID. We cannot come to work if someone is COVID positive and is allowed to work here. We cannot come to work unless you pay people to stay home if they're COVID positive for quarantine. We cannot come to work if you don't include ventilation, if you don't include HEPA filters. In other words, the basic structure that we need to protect ourselves at work has to be demanded on the job. And I see that as the only way we're going to get out of this pickle that we're in and, protect us from not only this virus, but the next one that's coming.
Okay, thank you, Nayvin. And I just recently interviewed the president of the transit workers, TW 250A, and many of their members now are being threatened with being terminated if they don't take the vaccine. At the same time, they don't really have a mass testing protocol to protect not only the drivers, but the passengers and the public. And that was one of the questions the drivers were asking. You want us to take vaccines, how do we know who's getting on the bus? And are you going to be testing the passengers? So that's a question from workers who are now faced with this. So our next speaker is going to be Michael Hull. He's the founder of Teachers Against Dying, and he's been active in fighting in the AFT and the labor movement to protect workers and teachers, and many of whom have lost their jobs and also have died because of a lack of protection from COVID. So welcome to this panel, Michael.
Thank you, Steve. And just to echo the previous speaker, it's in the hands of the working class to combat this because we've deferred long enough to politicians, we've deferred long enough to union bureaucrats, and I think it's becoming really evident. It's getting harder for the elites to conceal that this just isn't working, that the top crust or the upper crust of the union bureaucracy has been completely sold out. The politicians that mouth platitudes, they wear edgy dresses, they rip up speeches, they do all sorts of theater, but at the end of the day, they don't fight for you. They fight for the interests of the elite. And it's the same with the union bureaucracy. That's just another layer that we have to fight against. And it's not going to end until we realize that. And I think that is the biggest challenge for people like us. It's difficult for us because we have to educate people that these people aren't on your side. I'm working on a petition and to get signatures for Randy Weingarten to resign. And it was a rabbit hole. It was as John Locke would put it, the long train of abuses. I was just shocked when I did some deep diving into her relations with right-wing coups and right-wing elements in Ukraine, with meetings with Steve Bannon, all sorts of funneling money into charters and private schools through the COVID relief bills, and that's not even including my personal experience with her, where she lied to me. she said she could help people like myself with an accommodation because I was forced to go back against medical advice like many other teachers. So she lied to me, and she said that if a Delta variant spreads or a new variant, she would work to close the school. She's done the exact opposite. AFT has spent $5 million to send her off on a reopening tour. And this is in the midst of a spike. And this is in the midst of teachers being denied accommodations. And this is in the midst of bus drivers, shortages of bus drivers, shortages of staff. This is in the midst of Republican governors making it absolutely impossible for even remotely a safe school reopening. Here in Texas, our governor bans school districts from implementing mask mandates. How can you have safe school reopening? Why are you going to go on a 30-state $5 million tour to reopen? And you've got 28 million children can't get vaccinated. You're going to call that safe schools? You're going to call that fighting for us? No. We have to come together and realize that, you know, this person's not our friend. Joe Biden's not our friend. We have to come together and take matters into our own hands. So that's kind of my experience with her and my experience with the Democratic Party, and it's my experience with the union bureaucracy is I started out kind of naive like everyone else, thinking, you know, I could vote my way into a better world, or I could pay dues into a better world, but the material reality is getting harder to cloak that isn't the case. And we have to take matters into our own hands. I'm doing that petition. I also have a group called Teacher Protection Group so that teachers can cross-reference and document COVID violations and workplace harassment, because the unions simply don't allow that. They've kept us isolated. That's another thing she did. Another thing that the AFT did was they passed a resolution to keep us isolated. They said we will only support safety strikes on a case-by-case basis and as a last resort. When they actually materialized, there was no support. And that's consistent with what they did in 2018, when the teachers actually had wildcat strikes against union directives. People like Weingarten flew in. They tried to funnel that energy into the DNC. They tried to turn that into a vote for Democrat moment. They tried to isolate those workers and keep it from spreading, because at the end of the day, people like her are the establishment. They are working for the same people that want the economy reopened, no matter how many people die, and they are not for zero COVID. And at the end of the day, that's the fundamental problem, is that our country and the things that used to represent us, like to at least some modicum, like the Democratic Party or the trade unions, they've been completely co-opted. And we've returned back to the Gilded Age with tent cities reemerging. We have company cities coming back. We need a new labor party, and we need a new way to organize labor, or at least to recognize that we face opposition within the unions in the form of the union bureaucracy. So thank you, Steve, for having me on, and I look forward to this discussion.
Great. Thanks for joining us, Michael. And one of the debates that's going on now is in Australia, where Perth, and there have been some provinces that have actually had a zero COVID policy, and there have been demonstrations protesting the quarantines. And we have with us Davey Heller with a group called Class Conscious, who's been active in supporting a zero COVID movement in Australia. Welcome, Davey.
I'll just give you a bit of background about what's going on in Australia at the moment. We've got a kind of, as Steve said, a kind of peculiar situation where half the country is effectively zero COVID, and then we have our two most populous states in particular where COVID is growing rapidly and is moving towards a more American style opening up situation. How that kind of came about was right from the start, we have a far right Liberal government in Australia at a federal level who I think if they'd had their way would have let it rip right from the start. In a kind of, they were right from the start, we're talking about how we needed to balance any health measures against the economic costs, et cetera, et cetera. But they were kind of, we have a federal system here with states, but I think the states, they're the ones that are responsible for health. And they can also close internal borders. And that cut across this agenda. About a majority of the states as well are run by our Social Democratic Party in Australia, the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party. who are a complete pro-business party, just as much as the Democrats, but still do rest upon the trade union movements to some degree, more like the British Labour Party. And I think the combination of the states being panicked about their health systems collapsing, combined with a fear of a working class response, did lead to lockdowns early in the pandemic. And actually, it was quite openly discussed in sections of the bourgeois press that they were worried right from the start that this was going to work and suppress COVID completely. And they knew once that happened, this is capitalist logic, that was going to be a problem, because once you suppress COVID, how do you convince people to let it re-emerge? We're an island country. People here could see what was happening in the UK, Italy, and around the world, in America, with the horrific scenes coming out of America. And after a few months, there was basically no COVID here. So they knew, how are we going to reopen the borders? How are we going to stop having to pay people to stay home if there's an outbreak? They knew they had a problem. But basically, until the real thing that changed here was once the vaccines came, the situation of trying to suppress COVID, I think, became really intolerable for a section of our ruling class. They were like, we're not prepared to wear the cost anymore of these public health measures. And so this year in July, they had very leaky quarantine systems. So even that was helping the quarantine systems, like in a lot of other places, there was a denial of aerosol transmission. And it was reaching a point by about mid this year, we were having like one leak a week from a hotel quarantine somewhere in Australia, because they weren't tackling this. Unlike China, who's now building quarantine facilities, 5,000 people, where they're not going to leak. They were housed here in hotels in the middle of the cities, and it was never a good option. And they refused to build standalone quarantine systems. We have one of those in the country, in the Northern Territory, which is a former mining camp, where they have separate, huts and whatever for people. There hasn't been one leak from that. So it was never rocket science, and they knew it. And the fact that they didn't do it reflected this ambivalence about actually staying COVID-free. So anyway, they refused to lock down at first in Sydney in July, and COVID Delta got out of control. And then that now spread down to where I live in Melbourne. And after a couple of weeks of half-hearted attempt to maintain our zero COVID status, our Labor Premier threw up his hands and overnight started talking live with COVID, which maybe shouldn't have taken us all by surprise, but unfortunately that meant I even include myself here, there were illusions that was that this social democratic force was going to his part of the complications. You guys know what it replicates in America. The Murdoch press here, and a lot of the press and the Liberal Party had made bogeymans out of a social democratic figure like our Premier, Dan Andrews, for doing any lockdowns. And you know what it's like when the right wing targets someone, the temptation is to think, well, they must be left. Well, okay, that's not how it works. And yeah, he caved very quickly, and now we're having up to 2,000 cases a day. And the health system is really starting to buckle. And now they've really thrown their lot in New South Wales and Victoria with just relying on high vaccination rates to solve this, even though the evidence from overseas already is that's completely insufficient. But we still have half the country. The complexity for the ruling class is that half the country is still literally COVID-free. Not on the most populous 2 states on the East Coast, but I think it's like 4 out of the 7 states and territories are COVID-free, and that includes WA, Western Australia, which was where that rally I think Steve has mentioned was the first rally that was held in Australia to demand a zero COVID status a few weeks ago. And there's a little bit, like the ruling class often has multiple agendas. And in WA, one of the reasons they're quite determined to maintain a zero COVID status is they can't afford to have the mines shut down. You can't switch a mine on and off very quickly. And so like a 3-day shutdown because you have a positive case at a mine would cost the mining companies too much. So it's a complicated situation now in Australia. We still have zero COVID status in half the country. In half the country, we have this let it rip and rely on vaccine strategies. Into that space, a couple of things. I'll get there is a campaign that started, which I'm supporting. It's kind of led by, used to have the International Socialist Organization in America. You're probably all familiar with, like, the Australian section of that here is leading a health before profits campaign and trying to support the demands for zero COVID in the states where it's still zero COVID, and also in to a reversing of the policies in the states where it's been allowed to let rip. We have here another new thing for us, which you guys are more used of, is the emergence of a crazy right-wing anti-vax movement on the streets. Yeah, again, there's like a lot of illusions of Australian exceptionalism, which are being shattered week by week at the moment. And one of those was the explosion of those far-right protests on the street. Not every member of the protest is far-right, but the far-right were there, and it's a far-right agenda. And they've actually managed to infiltrate or co-opt or disorientate a section of the union movement here as well, under the banner of anti-vax. And so you probably saw some of the footage of those protests attacking. We've never seen anything like it here. There were many unionists, many construction workers in the crowd, plus other layers who were attacking their union office in Melbourne, and were only dispersed it was actually the first time we saw. They could have been dispersed differently, but the state chose to wait 8 hours while they trashed the office, and then at the end of the day, they sent in police with rubber bullets, which we've never even seen before in Melbourne. So it's part of showing how hot it is here at the moment. And this footage has gone around the world. And now Australia, obviously, we'll be looking into it. I don't know if you guys saw that Australia has become a far-right kind of hashtag. Did you guys hear about the Save Australia hashtag, or Australia has fallen hashtag? Did you guys see that rally in New York the other week? So a couple of hundred people, anti-vax people, protested outside the Australian embassy in New York, chanting Save Australia, because apparently, even though our ruling class is in the crazy world of the anti-vax movement, even though we are moving now after 18 months to open up, now we've become simultaneously apparently a North Korean style communist dictatorship, which suppresses individual liberties, and we need these people in New York to save us. But it also shows how this pandemic is feeding growing links between the far right movement around the world. We had people at the construction rally literally waving "Re-elect Donald Trump" flags. It's so it's part of that internationalization of this kind of co-opting of the far right. To bring this back to trade unions, in Australia, the trade unions have played pretty much the same role as they have in America or the UK or as anywhere else. The bureaucracies here have largely stayed silent on COVID as much as possible. They have supported a vaccination campaign, but that's completely in line with the government. But they're completely silent on zero COVID. They're silent on aerosol transmission. They're silent on mitigation measures. They're silent on the reckless reopening in New South Wales and Victoria, where there is resistance is occurring. I've spoken to workers in workplaces where resistance is occurring, and the bureaucracies are doing everything possible to keep it isolated. I think we know the script: keep it isolated, keep it out of the public eye, and suppress it. And so I think the challenge in Australia is exactly the same. It's workers here are no different to workers anywhere else. Funnily enough, they don't want to die of a disease just to go to work. But the avenue, there's no real avenue or outlet for that resistance to take shape. Where it is happening is isolated, and the bureaucracies are very successfully suppressing it and keeping it isolated. So we have the same challenge here, which is somehow to generate these new structures, new forms, which not to fight outside unions necessarily, but to link up workers who are isolated within unions and across different workplaces, so that to support each other. I'm keen to see how other people overseas, if they can get models like that up, and to try and emulate it here. That's the situation in Australia. There's still flashpoints ahead, particularly as schools open up. People are nervous about their children being sent back to school unvaccinated, because you can't unvaccinate the under 12s. Another complexity is, I said I'm involved in this campaign. this campaign, Health Before Profits, has actually been criticised by some sections of the so-called left. I don't know what kind of debates are occurring in America, but I know in Australia and places like France, there is some division amongst the left, where if you're seen to be pushing for zero COVID, you're pushing for repression. Or to, we have seen repression in this country in the enforcement of public health orders. We've seen police violence on the streets, really excessive against those protests. Those protests are completely reactionary, but I don't welcome the use of rubber bullets on the streets of Melbourne. That's going to be used against the left and the working class and unionists very quickly. And similarly, some of the lockdowns, whilst they've been soft on business, they have been very harsh on individual liberties. So we've had the Defence Force, on patrolling streets in Sydney. And so when you start talking zero COVID, there are disorientated elements of the left who think that you're endorsing a very heavy-handed state response. And of course, that's what none of us are talking about. We're talking about working class people organising. We are talking about pressuring the state, the capital state, to institute public health measures, but we're not supporting, of course, a drive for repression. But that's a debate that has to be waged and has to be won. Situation here is pretty fluid, and the ruling class are nervous of increased resistance. A sign of that was last week in New South Wales, they removed the Premier under a guise of a corruption scandal and replaced them with an even more far-right Premier. So this guy is, when Donald Trump was elected, he tweeted about this was a great victory for ordinary people and for freedom of speech. He's like on the far right of the Liberal Party, completely against lockdowns, and he's been brought in, coincidentally, a week before they were starting their real opening up. So obviously just to ensure that this is rammed through and that resistance from teachers, nurses, and you name it is railroaded. I'm glad Steve mentioned China. I mean, one of the things about China that I'll mention in the Australian context is it's quite difficult to talk to the working class here about China and how it's a success story in fighting COVID, because people immediately come back at you and say, well, that's a dictatorship. That doesn't relate. That's not relevant. Do you want to live in China? That's the kind of response you get. It's like, so there's been a lot of work whipping up anti-Chinese sentiment in the Australian working class, and that's bearing fruit, not just in the drive to war against China, but in keeping the public health measures in this public health debate. Of course, the joke is in Melbourne, I've been living under curfew. I've been in lockdown for 200 days. I've had, they've used every state measure that you could throw at China has been used in Melbourne. The difference is the Chinese have thrown enough resources at it and have actually wanted to eliminate. So they've used those measures, but they've actually worked. In Australia, they've curtailed civil liberties, but they never even wanted to eliminate COVID to begin with. So that's, I think, a challenge moving forward, but virtually the only country in the world that's maintaining this is COVID, is how we highlight that, and we don't let that get disappeared, and how we learn to talk to people about this isn't some kind of communist black magic. This is just public health measures which are being applied correctly. So that's the Australian experience. We've still got zero COVID to protect, unlike in America and half the country we don't. We're facing the same challenges with trade unions and learning and trying to find ways to link up workers and to deal with illusions, the same illusions in trade union bureaucracies, the same illusions in so-called progressive politicians. So thanks for letting me be part of this international panel. And that's the way we're going to get through this, is obviously from an international perspective as well. It's the only way to beat a pandemic. So thanks for letting me be part of it.
Thank you, Davey. And obviously the lessons in Australia are important to the American working class, who are unaware of really even what's going on in Australia and the internal struggle with what is happening with the politicians there and the unions. So our next speaker is Charles Rachlis. Charles is just a retired industrial hygienist with Cal-OSHA, and he's been active in fighting for more inspectors and proper health and safety protection for workers, and has been fighting the state of California, Governor Newsom, who has basically destroyed the Cal-OSHA system, which is supposed to protect 18 million workers in California. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. And good evening, everyone. Yeah, been more than just Gavin Newsom destroying Cal-OSHA. It was never really set up in the first place to protect the working class. And I think what was raised before about building rank and file health and safety committees in every workplace as the basis for getting to zero COVID really needs to be looked into as how we're going to get out of this. As it was mentioned earlier, the capitalist class is prepared to allow the pandemic to go endemic and say you have to live with it, which is kind of a reminder of the early politics when they came and said, well, you know, grandma and grandpa are just going to have to die to let the rest of us live. And that's basically what they're saying. There's been a little bit of an easing off in some urban centers in the North and the West in the United States, and people ease off, and there's less protective practices, and because the emphasis has been not on the public health 101, which was referred to, which would include enforcing ventilation, determining what is the proper ventilation, separating people, doing contact tracing effectively, and subsidizing people who need to be separated, either quarantined for periods of time or kept from going into work. Subsidizing them it was done with some unemployment, and that unemployment extensions have been cut out, and there were some moratorium on rent collections. And those moratoriums have been ended. So basically what the capitalist politicians, Democrats and Republicans alike, are saying to working people is, we didn't even give it our best shot and we're giving up on you, because they do know that the variants are coming, and that by not shutting it down, it gives more time for variants to develop. And do we know if these variants will be able to penetrate the vaccinated people who can become asymptomatic spreaders? Well, yes, we found that out, and to a large extent that's also perpetuated the spread. So I think the most important thing that we can do as observers and participants in this period of world history is realize that we were in an economic crisis even before COVID. We were in environmental crisis and catastrophe even before COVID. And to a large extent, that's what unleashed the virus from unprotected habitats that humans have made their way into, unleashing zoonotic disease upon the rest of us. And this is not going to end. We are not about to end that process in a few weeks, months, years, or decades. So we need to take control of the economy away from the class that has the interest of perpetuating only profit, and put it into the class, the working class, that has the interest of protecting the vast majority of people in the world who are working people, farmers, small workers, small artisans around the world. And that can only be done if we engage in class struggle politics, which means that we need to break from the capitalist parties that our trade union leaders have us tied to, and build our own working class party based on class struggle politics. And that means in every work site where we are building health and safety committees to take action, we need to understand and educate our coworkers as to the crisis that some call it the Anthropocene, but I would call it the Capitalocene. It's the great extinction that's being brought upon us by the rule of capitalism, and help our coworkers understand that the fight to save our lives and to be able to go home in the same condition that we came to work in, and to be safe at the work site, requires an end to capitalism and the taking over of the productive process by the working class. And that can really only be done by organizing in every workplace, creating our class struggle caucuses, building new trade unions, and taking the trade union leadership away from the bureaucracies which tie us to the capitalist politicians who have bent and swayed at every pressure from the Chamber of Commerce to open up. And we've been hearing that pressure right from the beginning. Oh, we have to open up. Oh, we have to open up. We can't let these kids stay out of school any longer. We have to open up. And within weeks of opening up this August, we had schools shutting down. We had multiple spreading events. And then they're starting to tell us, oh, indeed, children are getting sick and dying from COVID, something that we thought wasn't really happening before. So all of these things have happened. They have been in the news. And what hasn't happened is the working class as a class hasn't taken the power that it has to change the course of history. And that means that at this point, we are subject to the continuation of the process of control of the resources by the capitalist class. And they haven't given us the resources that we need to create the ventilation systems that we need for the schools and the workplaces to be safe. And to do that, we need to have industrial hygienists in the workplaces and in the schools and in the congregate settings to determine how to create airflow situations to separate the virus from the people. That's what we do with fumes. That's what we do with asbestos. That's what we do with lead. That's what we do with vapors. That is the job of industrial hygiene. And if it's not done, and it's not analyzed what is in the air and how it's moving, then it's going to get to everyone in that congregate setting, which could be your workplace, or it could be your school, it could be your gym locker room. And then we added in that conversation before about the asymptomatic spreaders and the breakthroughs with the vaccine. So this dependency on vaccines is not sufficient. And the brother brought up before the issue of it airborne transmission as opposed to droplet spread. And that's what we've talked about a number of times in these conferences. And Steve, you posted a important medical historical discussion in PowerPoint that it'd be good to keep posting that link for, where they explained how the medical tradition and history has undereducated the practitioners in terms of droplet and airborne. And that brings us right back to the beginning of this pandemic, when at first they identified it as airborne and the hospitals were giving out the N95s. And then the CDC and WHO re-identified it as droplet as opposed to airborne, which gave the hospitals an opportunity to back off on the distribution of N95s and back off on the isolation of the COVID patients from the airborne infection isolation rooms, which was necessary. And with that backing off from providing the necessary PPE and putting patients in places where the negative air wasn't sufficient to take the particles away, you had the soup that gave us a nightmare of nurses and doctors getting sick and dying. And that went on and can be reproduced over and over again. Eventually, the CDC had to concede because the particle scientists got out there in front of it and fought the argument that indeed it is airborne. And that's the science. That's the understanding that people are paying attention to. Have to put on the table. And that's part of what we have to address as health and safety committees in our unions, is we understand that surgical masking is not sufficient. We understand that vaccines are not sufficient. We have to understand that the working class needs to be protected by an evaluation of every workplace, of every congregate setting, with a proper airflow analysis of how to keep that air away from contaminated air away from everyone. And that ties into the asymptomatic spreaders who can be vaccinated. I've been vaccinated, and I can still have it and spread it to the people around me. Am I being tested? Why aren't we being tested? How come we don't have a mass testing procedure for everyone who goes into a congregate setting? So all of these issues are held back because it's not profitable. Like we were talking about the mines, it's not profitable to do all of this, and they're willing to sacrifice many of us. If we had a workers' government, and that's what we need, we would take all of the effort necessary. We would be able to employ, shorten the work week and put more people in place to do jobs and to evaluate the conditions and create safe conditions. But to do that, to win that, we're going to have to organize class struggle caucuses in our unions, take back unions and build unions where they don't exist, and build independent working class parties around the world that struggle to build workers' governments to institute the interests of the working class. And that's what we need to advocate for, because the science is there. It's not when this is going to happen again. We know it will happen again because of the mess that we've created out of the world under capitalism. And we know that the only class that has the interests of stopping the next pandemic and ending this one is the working class. So we have a world to win and nothing to lose but our chains. Thank you, Steve. Everyone. Good night.
Okay, thank you, Charles. And our last speaker is Carol, a teacher in the AFT PSC in CUNY.
I hope if we get nothing out of this, and we're going to obviously all sharing ideas that we all feel very strongly about, and we all come from a similar approach, that we organize something that's going to come out of this so that it's not, more conversation and less organization. So I wanted to just say that before I begin. One of the things that Trotsky noticed about New York City is that New York is an incredibly petty bourgeois city and has always been a very petty bourgeois city. So while the trade union bureaucrats are the same as in other places, we have a left in New York that essentially covers for the trade union bureaucracy. So for instance, in my union, I'm in the PSC, which is a local in the AFT. There's tons of leftists in the PSC. And we have, the PSC has organized health and safety committees. We're called the Watchdog Committee. I'm on the Watchdog Committee. And, whenever I say anything, the bureaucrats sort of roll their eyes. Because essentially they're doing absolutely nothing to challenge the administration. The CUNY, which is what I work for, the City University of New York, got $1 billion from the federal government. At my particular school, there are 3 classrooms that are usable. There are some buildings that part of the building is HVAC, some of the rest of the building is an HVAC. It's a sewer of this continued, COVID exchange between people. And every time you say something to the bureaucrats, they go, I don't know why they don't do what they're supposed to do. They're not doing it. And it's really, and I've been on this committee for months and months and months from its inception. But the problem is, it's not surprising, but the problem is the left inside of the PSC that doesn't even challenge the bureaucrats at all about anything whatsoever. So the fact is that the bureaucrats, they try to cover for management by saying, I don't know why they don't do what they're supposed to do. But essentially, it's at least the left's responsibility to challenge them. And that's not happening, in any of the unions. And in mine in particular, I'm on this thing called the International Committee that is for internationalism, is for supporting workers' struggles around the world. And yet those people don't want to alienate themselves either from the bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy essentially allows the management off the hook. There have been people who have gotten sick or have gotten, when they were tested, they had COVID. And the city university has not told anybody in those classrooms that that person was sick and they should go get themselves tested, because by and large, they don't want to let anybody know that there are sick people at the city university. And so they're perpetuating the spread of COVID. I mean, it's really mind-boggling. There's one school that's part of the city university where the windows are very big and they're hard to replace. So they nailed them shut. So now there's no air coming and going out of this particular building. The elevators don't work. And so everybody is cramped into one elevator when you're not supposed to be so close. You're supposed to keep a distance from people, and it's impossible because they don't want to spend the money that they got from the federal government to fix the infrastructure at all. So by and large, CUNY and the bourgeoisie in general has no intention of fixing this situation. They're going to allow it to spread, which is what they intended to do from the very beginning. Let the chips fall where they may. People will die, but the rest of the people will have a herd immunity, and then we'll get out of this. I mean, it's sort of mouthy. Malthus was this minister who lived during the 19th century, who basically thought that the working class caused the seed of their own destruction because they drank too much and they had too many children. And because they had too many children, the land couldn't afford to feed the number of people who were being born. And so there's going to be famine and plague and pestilence. And if people survive it, well, that's fine and good, and we can raise their wages. But this is the mentality of capitalism is just completely in a thorough and incomplete crisis. And there's not going to be a fixing of this. The way, and a number of people have mentioned this, David, Charles, about the way that they raise animals in industrialized settings means that they're moving into animal habitats. The environment is completely falling apart, and with poor irrigation system, poor air quality, that's going to spread disease on top of the mass industrialization of farming. It's, I just sort of want to end by saying that before the Russian Revolution, Russia had completely fallen apart. The state was incapable of distributing food to people in war situations. The economy is even worse than normal. People had no food. They had no place to live. They were freezing to death. There was a profound crisis, so it wasn't surprising that ultimately there was a revolution in Russia. But what the working class did was take charge. They said the people who are running the state, the Tsar and all of his men, the capitalists who were in the Duma, were incapable of resolving the problem for the working class. They were not distributing food. people were starving. There was mass prostitution because there were no jobs. Women were selling their kids, selling their bodies. So the working class did what it could under the most horrendous of all situations, because Russia was an incredibly backward country, but they tried to mobilize and sort of an alternate state within the state that was collapsing. And so they found food for people. They tried to find housing for people. They did what they could. They would not allow actually czarist, movements unless they thought that it was absolutely necessary to allow these things to happen. And so what we have to do is, I'm hoping, as I said, that we create something out of this. We have to build a movement that is based on the working class, because it's only the working class that wants to save our asses. The capitalists don't care. They're going to let, millions of people die. There's going to be another pandemic because they're continuing. It's doing what they're doing. The vaccine, which gave Pfizer, Moderna, and all those other companies, J&J, billions and billions of dollars, rather than resolving the problems of the environment and making sure that people stay home until, and have a genuine COVID policy. They cannot do that. It has to be us. And so I agree with Charles that, basically we have to overthrow this thing and set up a worker state. But in the meantime, we have to let people know that it's only going to be the working class that can organize this sort of alternative way of running society. And, it's very difficult because the union bureaucracy is completely tied at the hip to the capitalists. And unfortunately, I can't speak for the left in other places, but the left in New York is pretty, disreputable. So, I'm doing what I can. There are individual people who are, but, maybe if we get out some sort of petition, some sort of manifesto, then we can start distributing that wherever we are and saying, look, this is what's happening in New Zealand. This is what's happening in China. This is what's happening in wherever they're beginning to crush it, and get a manifesto out and start doing what, organizing petition campaigns. But we have to develop a strategy because, if it's true that, I thought there was something like 700,000 people, but if it's true that there's really, 1 million people and it's counting, then, we're not going to be able to turn this around. There'll be new variants, and that means more deaths and more vaccine, and not, coming up with a strategy to resolve the problem. So I'm hoping that we can write some sort of manifesto after this and see what we can do to move this thing forward, because otherwise it means destruction, I believe, of, the human race and the species, all the species that are on the planet.
Thank you, Carol. I want to make a couple of comments and we'll open it up. And one of the issues is the United Front. United Front again for zero COVID policy, a United Front for public health program, which we don't have in the United States. And it's very clear that the Democratic Party, Biden and Sanders and others, have done nothing from their promises. You would think that in a COVID pandemic, we would have national health care in California. The Democrats have a supermajority, yet people are going bankrupt, people being charged. I just talked to a friend of mine who had to leave to go to Japan. They're charging $250 for tests, fast tests, speed tests for COVID. But the mass of people still do not have testing. There are no plans to have mass testing, which means the capitalists are not interested in really shutting down the virus, because you have to have a testing protocol. So I think we need a united front of workers in this country. And I think that the movement that we have supported for a general strike by the Vermont AFL-CIO has to be taken up more and more unions. This is not going to be solved by small groups, just individuals. There has to be a mass working class movement. And the only thing the capitalists understand is when the system shuts down and they don't make their profits. And that means that we have to raise the issue of mass working class action and workers taking over the pharmaceutical industry. We cannot have, and this is one of the reasons workers are opposed to taking the vaccine, is they don't trust the pharmaceutical industry. And I don't blame them, because the fact of the matter is Pfizer and these companies are actually financing the studies that the CDC and the National Institute of Health are using to say we need more vaccines. So how can anybody trust these companies when they are funding the studies that say we need more vaccines? So, and obviously the Democrats' solution is more vaccines, boosters, more drugs. So I think we can organize, and at least at City College in San Francisco, we had a press conference, we supported a rally, and we're going to be organizing for a zero COVID campaign and against the bureaucracy and the union, which are refusing to even raise the issue of a mass testing protocol and basically just going along with whatever management wants. So I think that that is really key. And it means a united front. It means raising the issue of a workers' party, a labor party. That means raising the issue of a general strike against the capitalists, against the Democrats and Republicans who are criminally negligent, who are responsible for the murder of over 700,000 people. They did not have to die. And that is the reality. People don't have to die from COVID, but they are dying in a system that bases itself on profits. So why don't we open it up and have a discussion if anybody has any comments or would like to speak?
Yeah, I want to support what Carol was saying really at the beginning of her speech, you know, that we need to come out of this with some tools for organization. And to speak to your point, I mean, I think given the consciousness of the working class is at a very low level, and not to say that a general strike wouldn't be a great goal, I think that should be included, but it would be nice to have sort of like you say, a manifesto or a 10-point program for workers' health and safety, you know, that incorporates what they need to do or what they can do on the job to demand from their various bosses and employers, specifically how to protect themselves. And if they're doing that on every job and every location, and it's part of a whole link to others trying to fight for those small steps on the job, because that's the important thing. When you go to work, you don't want to get sick. You don't want to take the virus home to your family. So that's really where people, I think, can understand and relate to the need to fight for their own health, their own family's health. And so we can have some kind of 10-point, simple, one-page program that says, you know, join us, demand this on your job. Then we can go to the next level, and maybe the 10th point would be when we get enough people together, what we need is a general strike, et cetera. So sort of just to follow up on both what you said and Carol said about getting from where we are, which is a small group of understanding about COVID, zero COVID, to the general strike or revolution, it might be good to see it in this way.
I'd like to say that, you know, one of the things we really need, I agree with you, David, that one of the points should be free healthcare. So we need single payer. People can't go to the doctor so that they can't do anything about being sick. And many of the people who can't go to the doctor also can't afford to take off from work. And so they end up coming back to work or going back to their communities and spread it, because they're now, a number of them are immigrants or undocumented. And so they're being forced to work. Otherwise, their employer is going to call, you know, ICE and get them arrested. And so they are sick and dying and bringing it back to their communities. And even if people aren't necessarily immigrants, many people are eat poorly because they get very low salaries, and so they eat crappy food, and so there's a lot of comorbidity. The people who are dying most in this country are people who are poor, and those people are generally Black and Latin because they're not paid well enough to be able to support them and their families. And so we have to start demanding higher wages. We have to demand 30 for 40, 20 for 40, closing down plants that are Amazon. There was an Amazon plant in Staten Island that somebody led a strike and pulled people out, and he got fired. So I mean, we need workers' control. And maybe before we have to say that, but before we get to workers' control, we need to make sure that people get free health care, and that people aren't kicked out of their homes, and that the rent moratorium is up. People are going to end up in the street. Thousands of people died of COVID because they don't have any shelter. I mean, the whole thing is sick and diseased. And so I think maybe writing a 10-point program with all of this incorporated is a good idea.
Okay, Brenda Barrows, who is SEIU, member of SEIU 1021 of the General Hospital chapter in San Francisco, had some technical problems coming on, but I was able to get her by voice, and she has been fighting to protect workers there who've been dying on the job, and she's going to make a little report on what's going on at General Hospital with public health workers. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you, Steve. Glad to be here.
So maybe you can talk, Brenda, about COVID, what's happening at General Hospital, your fight to protect the workers at General Hospital and the public as well.
One of the issues that we're having is the mixed messaging coming from the employer. There is a division among employees even versus people who are vaccinated versus people who aren't vaccinated. But the main thing that we're trying to do is make sure that we keep our protections in place to avoid people getting COVID. I mean, we have an example, which is worst case scenario. We had a gentleman who passed away from COVID. He was somebody who had long-standing illnesses. He tried to get them to allow him to telecommute for a month, and basically ended up getting COVID and dying within a week. So, those are the kind of things that are happening now, and those are the push and pulls of what to do about this. And the rules keep changing, the standards keep changing. The city took away distancing, so they're still cramming people into offices. So it's pretty bad for some people, especially those who have fear of COVID. Some people, just like people everywhere, some people aren't worrying about it. They got their vaccine. They're not tripping. As you can see, they're out on the streets as if COVID they're behaving as if it's almost over. But I know, because one of the jobs I'm working in now is in the COVID vax center. And so I know that people are still dying. But, I guess corporate money has become more important. And so a lot of the protections people had as employees are waning right now.
And have you been provided N95 masks? Have there been training for all the workers on how to use masks?
Some people are and some not. Like I said, it's hit and miss. Some people are and some people are not. If you work in an area that's not considered a quote unquote clinical area, you won't get N95 masks. Even though we're walking through the same facilities, we're eating in the same cafeteria areas with other people. So, it's not consistent. It is not consistent.
And is there a disparity of treatment between white, black, and brown workers, public workers?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, but that was before pre-COVID, but, it's been for years. Professor Gould, the city bought in, to their credit, Professor Gould, who did this examination and interviewed many employees, particularly a lot of Black employees. And so the results are horrible. So what we have known as employees all along has been proven. So that was the end of his results. And so now it's going to lead to where one of the supervisors in San Francisco, Shaman Walton, wants to put something on the ballot, you know, to make permanent change. Because our fear is they can make these ordinances in different things, but it's not like law. If it becomes a part of the city charter, then it doesn't matter who the mayor is or who the supervisors are, it's still law. So those are the kind of permanent protections that we are seeking. We're not going to go for the same old stuff like before. Right now, we're really pushing for permanent changes that will deal with the inherent, you know, discrimination that's built into the system for hiring. We're the most hired. I mean, the results showed that we're the most fired, last hired, paid the least, and treated the worst.
And the issue of testing, is there mass testing for the employees at San Francisco General Hospital?
Well, at the hospital, what the city has done is they've given people a certain amount of time to become vaccinated. They can apply for medical exemptions, or they can apply for religious exemption. If you get one of those exemptions approved, and that's the key, they have to approve it. Just because you ask for it doesn't mean you automatically get it. And then, which case, if you don't have it by a certain date, you will be terminated. They're sending out slowly packets to people already to tell them if they're not vaccinated by a certain date, then they're relinquishing their jobs. But the ones who get the thing, they get tested minimally twice a week. So they can walk up to you at any moment and ask you to be tested twice a week.
But they're not providing testing for everyone as a protocol for testing.
No. It's not like all employees are going to be tested. So right now, it's only if you come into contact with, and they decide what close contact is. If you come into close contact with someone, then you can be tested. If not, then they won't be tested, and you have to go to your private doctor to get tested.
And you get charged for that. I know, people are being charged.
Yeah, I mean, you pay for it. I don't know what each health plan does, but and I think that's going to really hurt people who don't have good health plans, right? Workers out there that do not have good health plans, like city workers do, and those people are going to end up having to pay out of their pocket if they want to travel.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this shows the real bankrupt policy of the government, U.S. government, and the politicians. I understand the mayor said that they're going to relax the masking requirements now because COVID is going away.
Right. That goes to what I was saying. It's like the pressure from the economy within the city seem to be overtaking the protection of the people in the city, because there are clamoring of people to have things open. They're clamoring for people who want to go see the Warriors play. Clamoring of people, so there's a large percentage of the population who want it to go back to normal, and they're willing to risk it to have it go back to normal. And that's what we're seeing.
Even though the pandemic is still with us.
Even though the pandemic is still with us.
Yeah.
Even though the pandemic is still with us.
Which
right? Because if you look at the people that weren't vaccinated when the city went into this, people would be surprised how many of them were nurses that were not vaccinated and did not want to get vaccinated. And until they put in that legislation saying you were going to lose your employment, they didn't get vaccinated. And a lot of them are asking for exemption.
And even if you get vaccinated, you can still give off the virus.
Yeah, because, I think there's a misconception about COVID vaccine. What COVID vaccine does is it in most cases, nothing is 100%. In most cases, it will prevent you from becoming terminally ill and dying of COVID. You may get sick, but you won't be to the point where you have to be in the ICU. So that's the advantage. And that has always been what the clinical people have said, is that it's not a guarantee, but it will prevent you from becoming severely ill and dying, which is the main thing they're trying to stop, is the death.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. Any other comments you would like to make?
No, just we have our ongoing battle, and we still have meetings with the Board of Supervisors, and the African American workers in San Francisco are fighting a tough fight. And we're not going to relent, and we're not going to back down, and it's never going to go away. As much as they push, we're starting to get pushback now, right? There's starting to be some forms of retaliation to the people that are out there fighting, but we're not going to give up.
Okay, thank you, Brenda.
This is Charles. So just a few things that came up in the discussion. And we talked about getting medical care, health care for all. That would be considered some sort of reform under the situation that we are now. And there's many similar reforms that we need to have a healthy community. And that would include things like daycare for all, education for all, jobs, housing, decent food for all. And ultimately, we might win bits and pieces of these through the pressure that we can put on the capitalist class through organizing in the workplace and having mass actions and strikes. But we're not going to be able to sustain it unless we take over the economy and put it in the hands of the working class ourselves. And that includes control of the intellectual labor and the product of intellectual labor. And that goes to a large issue of the fears that people have and that we talked about of vaccines and medications. And because the intellectual property rights make secrets of the science and protect the science from public scrutiny and contain it in the hands of the corporations. So we need to free the intellectual labor from the for-profit institutions, and that has to be part of our program, possibly our 10-point or whatever point manifesto, because those intellectual property rights that are so coveted by the capitalist class include their right to make a profit off of our inability to hold them to scrutiny. And they do have a rotten history, and we know why they have a rotten history. And so I just wanted to raise that again. And I think that's the last point I wanted to make tonight.
Just a couple things. I think the idea of a 10-point plan sounds, manifesto sounds great. I just caution, if it's in the tradition of a transitional plan, transitional demands, you kind of want to start with what workers should be fighting for on the job. And then you do reach those bigger goals later about what would actually be needed to make those happen on a collective level. You do want to be cautious a little bit about throwing in the kitchen sink and losing focus. So it is a balance there, like something like you mentioned, free childcare or whatever, like totally relevant, totally, but you are going to be wanting to present this to workers as an urgent thing in the pandemic. So there's a bit of crafting and thought that needs to go into how to bring those broader ones in. The second thing is whether how this manifesto or 10-point plan in the workplace relates to the problems that have been raised with the trade unions. Are these motions that we're trying to get passed, which will then immediately come up against the resistance of the bureaucrats, and that's how it brings it in. So you don't mention the bureaucrats, but it'll be what's built into this program is somehow, I mean, even just fighting for them at a workplace will bring you into conflict with the bureaucrats. So, but do we mention, or does this document mention the bureaucrats, or is it something which this is a path for workers to both fight them and expose those bureaucrats in action, in struggle? So I just was curious about what the thoughts were on that.
At the failure of the unions to even do education of their members. I mean, one of the reasons for this rebellion of a lot of workers is that there hasn't been education in the labor movement. Industrial hygienists and have not even been hired to educate workers about the dangers of how to protect yourself. The reason is that the unions don't want to fight management over the issue of ventilation, over the issue of a protocol for testing. The fact that we just heard from Brenda that they don't even have a mass protocol for testing at San Francisco General Public Hospital is completely criminal. It's criminal because you need a mass testing protocol to know whether the virus is there and who has it. And simply giving people vaccines is not adequate. So I think that we should develop a 10-point manifesto. And I do think we should say that we will fight in trade unions and in committees, rank and file committees, for the implementation of this policy. And of course, if you fight in a union, as the AFT members 2121 are fighting in City College, they're coming up straight against the union bureaucracy, who their solution to the COVID pandemic is to send out a survey to the members, the faculty, about what they think is most important for protection against COVID, as if they're educated about how to fight COVID. I mean, survey. I mean, what do you think is most important in fighting COVID? I mean, to the members. This was their action plan to defend against COVID. No demands, no campaign, education campaign. And I think that that's generally the case throughout the country. I don't know of any, besides the nurses union, which actually is opposing the lifting of requirements for masks. They've just issued a statement saying it's wrong time to actually abandon mask protocols because the virus is still there. Most of the unions are not doing that. In fact, in San Francisco, the unions who are facing the termination of their members have no united front to say we should not be terminating members who don't want to take the vaccine. We should have a mass testing protocol. In New Zealand, as a matter of fact, 36% of the people there, including workers, do not have the vaccine, but they were able to suppress the virus. That is certainly not the case in the United States. But I think the failure to even have a mass testing protocol obviously is something that we want to have in this program, this manifesto. So that would be what I think we should do around this manifesto in relationship to the unions and rank and file committees to fight for protection of workers and the public.
I thought that Davey's question about how would we propose this, starting with the most concrete sort of to move upward, is a thoughtful thing to sort of raise. And do we want to attack the bureaucracy or not? And I was like thinking about it as you were talking, and I thought that there's no way that we can't attack them. And it doesn't have to be, oh, those fuckers, they don't want to, they're just tied to management, they don't want to do shit. But I think we have to talk about their absolute failure. I have sat on a committee, a watchdog committee, every friggin' week for months and months and months. And yet the elevators in buildings are not working, which means everybody has to squash into an elevator. There's no HVAC system. And where I work, there are 3 classrooms that are livable, right? That they have some sort of HVAC system. Some of the buildings, there's an HVAC system on one floor and not on another. I mean, it's bizarre. The City University got $1 billion from the government. And so I think maybe one of the things for our manifesto is open the books to different, types of management. Where are you spending the money? Where's this money going? And so I think that we have to just say that this has been an utter failure. 700,000 people have died for what? The union should have stepped in. They should have said, no, you don't give a crap about people. It's clear that you're going to let them die. And we think that we have to provide an alternative. So, you know, as I'm saying, I don't think we have to necessarily, as much as I hate them, I think we have to say that we need an alternative now, that these people are aiding and abetting, you know, murder on the part of management, and that what we need is for workers to do what, you know, essentially Charles said, is to get the intellectual property about the science, like what really is going on. You have Fauci saying one thing one day, one thing another day. That's why nobody believes these people. You have to wear a mask. You don't have to wear a mask. You should get a vaccine. You should. I mean, really, these are the people who are in charge. These are the people who are the you know, the ones who are in the know. It's outrageous. And so I think we have to start out our manifesto saying that, and that what we need is real workers' control of you know, getting a handle on COVID. And that means committees of genuine worker committees that are not tied to the trade unions, who accept anything that management says, or will propose something to management. Management says, no, we can't do that. They go, oh, I don't know what to do now. So, you know, we have to talk about how workers are the ones that need to be doing this and taking it out of the hands of the, you know, the capitalists and the trade union lackeys.
And I think, so I think we're all agreed on this manifesto. We should work on it. But of course, the other political question is the Democrats, the workers, to have their own political party, because the program that we're talking about is not going to be implemented in the Democrats. And when you talk about even reform, we have the Democrats in charge in California, and there's no single payer. There's no health care for all, right, in California and in New York, where the Democrats have a majority as well. So in the blue states, where the Democrats are in control, they're not implementing health care for all in the midst of a pandemic. So I think we've had actually a useful discussion, and maybe we can work on this program. We should work on this manifesto and then reconvene, go over the manifesto, and then begin a campaign to take it up in unions, among work locations, and in all over the country, and fighting for a COVID zero policy that will save lives. 700,000 is too many. Zero COVID deaths. That's what we have to say.